The paper was thin, almost translucent, and printed with regulations in 2 languages. Across the top ran the unmistakable black stamp, Kriegsgefangenenpost, prisoner of war mail. Beneath it, a date, a number, and the careful script of a man determined to say as much as he could in the few lines permitted. His handwriting was neat, compact, pressed tightly to conserve space. He bent over the paper at a wooden table in a drafty barrack, surrounded by the muted noise of hundreds of other men doing the same. He paused, tapped the pen against his lip, and then wrote a line that even he found absurd. "They have ice cream here." It was not a boast. It was not a joke. It was a fact, simple, unadorned, permitted by the rules of censorship. He could not describe the fences outside, nor the guard towers, nor the distant rumble of freight trains. He could not sketch the layout of the camp, nor note the numbers of soldiers he saw, nor mention the rumors that floated among the bunks. But he could describe food. He could describe weather. He could describe his health. And so, in a space meant for reassurance, he recorded what had shocked him most. The enemy gave their captives ice cream. That one line would travel farther than he could imagine. From his hand, to the camp censor's desk, to the canvas mailbag stamped POW, onto a truck, then a train, then through the intricate system of neutral exchange. It would be logged by clerks in Geneva, shuffled through Red Cross offices, passed across borders by neutral diplomats, sealed again and carried into a battered Germany. And at the end of that journey, it would be opened by a mother in a gray apartment in Cologne, her ration cards already spent for the month, her table bare but for turnips and black bread. She would read the line once, twice, 3 times. Ice cream? The radio said Americans beat their prisoners, starved them, worked them to death. But her son's hand said otherwise. For her, and for thousands like her, that tiny detail cracked open a world of doubt. The rules were strict but humane. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to send at least 2 letters and 4 cards each month. The United States, eager to demonstrate both its adherence to international law and its moral superiority, often allowed more. To make censorship manageable, the letters were written on standardized forms, a single sheet, pre-printed, designed to be folded into itself like an envelope. No need for glue, no need for additional paper, and no room for more than a few hundred words. In the camps, distribution of these sheets was a ritual. Once or twice a week, clerks handed them out. Prisoners hunched over their tables, and for an hour the noisy barracks fell into silence, broken only by the scratch of pens. Men who had fought across deserts and forests, who had survived torpedoes and strafing runs, now concentrated on tiny questions: how to squeeze their handwriting smaller, how to fit reassurance into so few lines, how to signal to loved ones without crossing the invisible lines of censorship. Censors worked in offices close by. They were young lieutenants, chaplains, sometimes even school teachers in uniform. They read quickly but carefully, eyes scanning for forbidden details. A reference to a guard tower was cut. A mention of troop movements overheard on a radio was struck out. But descriptions of food, of weather, of health, those slipped through. They were harmless to security, harmless to strategy. And yet, they were powerful in ways no censor could fully imagine. After inspection, letters were bundled into canvas sacks, each sack tagged with camp and date. Trucks carried them to sorting depots, where military clerks and Red Cross representatives ensured the rules were followed. From there, they entered neutral channels. In Switzerland, the International Committee of the Red Cross became the hub. Clerks in Geneva, wearing armbands with red crosses, opened, counted, and resealed mail bags. German-bound letters went across Switzerland into the Reich's own postal network. Italian-bound mail sometimes moved through the Vatican. The process was slow, but it worked. Letters often took 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, but arrive they did. Compared to rumor, compared to propaganda, these letters carried a strange credibility. They bore the actual handwriting of a son, a brother, a husband. They carried little details that could not be faked. A misspelling, a family joke, a nickname only a mother would know. And they carried facts, tiny, ordinary facts, that clashed with the thunder of the radio. That is what made them dangerous to propaganda. Radios shouted in slogans. Leaflets promised paradise or threatened doom. But letters whispered in specifics. We have cigarettes. I am healthy. The camp canteen sells ice cream. These details were too trivial to be propaganda, too small to be manufactured. They sounded exactly like what they were, the observations of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. In Hamburg, a widow remembered neighbors gathering to hear a letter read aloud. One woman's son wrote that he had eaten white bread. Another's son wrote of playing cards with Italian prisoners. A third letter, the most astonishing, mentioned that the PX sold ice cream on Sundays. The listeners laughed nervously, then fell silent. If these things were true, then how much else had they been lied to about? The Americans understood the value of mail, though not always its power abroad. For camp officers, allowing letters was simply good policy. It reduced unrest, curbed despair, and gave prisoners a stake in order. A man who could write home was less likely to mutiny or attempt escape. But higher up the chain, in the Psychological Warfare Division of SHAEF, officers studied the letters with interest. Extracts from captured German mail were collated and analyzed. Reports noted how often food was mentioned, how often health was praised, how often prisoners described humane treatment. One file noted that references to sweets, dairy, and abundance in American camps contradict enemy propaganda and lower morale in Germany. The irony was rich. The prisoners themselves became unwitting agents of psychological warfare, carrying the truth home more effectively than any Allied leaflet ever could. But why ice cream? Of all the things to write about, why that? Because to men raised in a continent of scarcity, ice cream was luxury incarnate. Milk had vanished from German cities by 1942. Butter was reserved for officers. Sugar was rationed to a handful of grams a week. Children in Berlin grew up without tasting sweets beyond watery jam. And here in captivity, their fathers and brothers scooped up bowls of cold cream, flavored with chocolate or strawberry, served casually as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. One German officer later admitted, "We did not believe it at first. We thought perhaps it was an American trick. But when several letters arrived from different camps all saying the same, we knew." For Italians, the irony cut deeper. Italy, home of gelato, had been stripped bare by war. Cities starved. Yet in Texas or Arkansas, Italian prisoners rediscovered ice cream under the enemy's care. Some joked in letters that they had been captured by dairy farmers. Others wrote with quiet wonder that the Americans ate like kings even in wartime. Picture again the apartment in Cologne. The mother, her ration cards thin as paper, her cupboard bare. The letter trembles in her hand. She does not want to believe it. She cannot afford to believe it. But she knows her son's handwriting. She knows the way he underlines certain words, the rhythm of his sentences. And she knows he would not waste precious space on lies. Her neighbor leans in. What does he say? She reads aloud. We even have ice cream. Silence falls. Outside, the radio blares about American brutality. Inside, the women look at each other with a new, dangerous thought. What if the radio is lying? That is how propaganda unravels. Not with thunder, but with whispers. Not with dramatic revelations, but with details too mundane to dispute. Ice cream in a prisoner of war camp was not just a dessert. It was a symbol, a wedge, a crack in the wall of lies. It carried across oceans, across borders, across battle lines. It did what tanks and planes could not. It changed minds quietly, irresistibly, one letter at a time. The prisoner did not know all this as he folded his sheet and handed it to the clerk. He only knew that he had tasted something sweet, something he had not tasted in years, and that he wanted his mother to know he was alive. He signed his name, sealed the form, and moved on. Weeks later, in a bombed-out apartment, his mother would read the line and smile through her tears, and somewhere, far above her, the scaffolding of belief, the brittle architecture of lies, would creak under the weight of a single sentence. They have ice cream here. The trains moved slowly through the American countryside, pulling long strings of boxcars and converted coaches filled with men who had once worn the gray of the Wehrmacht or the khaki of the Italian army. Their windows were covered, guarded at every junction, but the air that slipped through cracks in the boards carried scents they could not mistake. Fresh bread from a bakery near a small station, the tang of gasoline from endless lines of trucks on nearby roads, the whistle of another train hauling grain. They did not know it yet, but they were entering the largest logistical system of captivity the world had ever seen. The United States had built not just camps, but a machine designed to manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners across an entire continent. Upon arrival, their first shock was silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of order. Camps were neat, with rows of barracks, gravel paths, barbed wire strung tightly but cleanly, and watchtowers that looked more perfunctory than threatening. The guards were armed, yes, but their uniforms were crisp, their movements casual, their discipline firm but not cruel. Processing began almost immediately. Men lined up, were counted, their names and units taken down, their clothes deloused, and their medical condition recorded. Doctors with stethoscopes moved briskly along the lines, noting malnutrition, infections, untreated wounds. For many prisoners, this was the first medical examination they had received in years. They were issued clean clothing, blankets, and assigned to barracks. Then came something none had expected: stationery. Each man was handed a folded sheet, pre-printed in German and English, with space for a short message home. A pencil accompanied it. The instructions were simple. Write to your family, tell them you are alive, but do not mention locations, units, or other military matters. The atmosphere in the barracks on those first nights was one of restless scratching. Hundreds of pens and pencils moving over paper. Hundreds of men struggling to condense their lives into a few short sentences. Many began the same way. I am alive. I am healthy. Do not worry. These were the permitted reassurances. But some went further, testing the boundaries of what would pass through censors. One man wrote of the bread, soft and white, unlike the coarse rye of home. Another wrote of soap, plentiful and scented faintly of pine. And again came references to food: eggs, meat, vegetables, coffee, and sometimes, with astonishment, ice cream. American authorities expected such details to pass through. They did not fear them. The logic was simple. A prisoner who could tell his family he was well-fed and healthy was less likely to cause trouble. A family that heard their son was alive was less likely to curse the Americans as monsters. And though no one said it aloud, such letters were themselves a weapon. They contradicted enemy propaganda without any need for Allied broadcasts. They carried authenticity because they came in the prisoner's own hand. The censors worked with quiet efficiency. In each camp, an office was staffed by clerks who spoke German or Italian, trained to scan letters quickly. They used black pencils to strike out forbidden words. Occasionally, a whole sentence vanished under a heavy line, but most letters survived intact. Details about food, weather, health, or even the small pleasures of camp life were allowed. When prisoners wrote about ice cream, nobody stopped them. What harm could such a thing do? The answer, though not fully realized at the time, was quite a lot. Once censored, the letters embarked on journeys as complex as any military convoy. Trucks carried them from camps to depots where they were sorted and bagged. Red Cross representatives added seals, ensuring that Geneva could vouch for their authenticity. Bags went by rail to ports, then by ship to neutral countries, usually through Lisbon or Stockholm, sometimes via Switzerland. In Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross opened them again, checked counts, resealed, and dispatched them into Germany's battered postal system. The process could take 6 weeks, sometimes 3 months, but eventually most letters reached their destination. Families waited anxiously at mail calls, rushing to post offices when word spread that a new bag had arrived. The impact on those families was enormous. In a society saturated with propaganda, where Goebbels' ministry controlled newspapers and radio, these letters were the one unfiltered contact with the outside world. They were trusted because they were personal. A mother recognized her son's handwriting, his turn of phrase, the way he crossed his T's. A wife recognized her husband's dry humor, even compressed into a single line. A brother saw a nickname only he would understand. No broadcast could replicate that authenticity. What made the letters dangerous to the Nazi regime was their mundanity. No one expected a prisoner to waste space on lies. If he wrote that he had eaten ice cream, then he had eaten ice cream. If he wrote that he was allowed to attend church service on Sunday, then it must be true. If he wrote that he had received medical care, then his captors must not be monsters. Each detail chipped away at the edifice of propaganda that painted Americans as cruel and barbarous. Some letters survived intact into archives. Historians have read them, astonished at the consistency of themes. Food is the most common. Health, cleanliness, and humane treatment follow. And sprinkled among them, like cherries atop the reports, are references to ice cream. It became a symbol, an emblem of abundance that struck home precisely because it was trivial. Nobody starved makes up a story about ice cream. Nobody facing cruelty would waste words on such a detail. American intelligence quickly realized the secondary effect. Reports circulated noting how frequently German and Italian mail mentioned good treatment. Analysts in London and Washington began to see prisoner letters as a subtle but effective tool of psychological warfare. They were authentic, uncontrollable, and therefore more powerful than any leaflet. When neutral diplomats reported hearing German families discussing these letters, Allied officials took notice. Some even considered ways to quietly encourage the theme, ensuring that small luxuries like ice cream remained available precisely because they made such an impression. Within the camps, prisoners discussed what they could and could not say. They developed a quiet code. Health meant truly healthy, or sometimes meant alive but weary. Weather could signal conditions indirectly, but food was described in detail because it reassured families. Some even exaggerated, boasting of meals that were better than they were, just to ease the burden on mothers and wives back home. Yet even when exaggeration crept in, the underlying truth remained. They were not starving. They were not being brutalized. They were being treated in ways that contrasted sharply with what their government had told them to expect. Consider the psychological effect. A soldier captured in Normandy expecting torment writes home that he has been fed, clothed, and even given ice cream. His letter arrives in Dortmund, where the local paper has just published another article claiming Americans torture prisoners. Which will the family believe? The faceless voice of propaganda, or the handwriting of their own son? Time and again, families chose the latter. Trust in the government eroded, not in dramatic explosions, but in countless small cracks, opened by thousands of ordinary letters. Neighbors read these letters aloud to each other. In towns where several sons had been captured, families compared notes. My Hans says they gave him white bread. My Karl says he had chocolate. My Otto says they gave him ice cream. The laughter that followed was not mocking but bewildered. Could it be true? And if it was, what else had been false? The American system was not perfect. Delays occurred, some letters were lost, some censored heavily. Yet the sheer volume, hundreds of thousands of letters each month, ensured that the flow of information could not be stopped. Even when Germany itself collapsed into rubble and chaos, the trickle of prisoner mail continued, a lifeline of truth. The letters revealed something else too. The prisoners themselves were changed by writing them. To put words on paper, to reassure family, to note details of comfort, reminded them of their own humanity. It gave them a voice in a situation otherwise defined by silence and captivity. Writing that they had eaten ice cream was not just a report. It was a moment of self-assertion, a claim that life still held surprises, even in defeat. Later, when historians pieced together how Nazi propaganda faltered, they found many causes: military defeat, Allied bombing, the sheer weight of disaster. But in the quiet margins, they noted something humbler. Letters from prisoners filled with talk of food and music and unexpected kindness had corroded the credibility of the regime. They were small cracks, but millions of small cracks can bring down the tallest wall. And so the image persists. A camp, a barrack, a man hunched over paper, a censor scanning quickly, allowing a detail to slip through, a mother opening a letter in a cold German flat, reading a line that makes no sense according to the radio. And somewhere unseen, the machinery of propaganda groans under the weight of doubt, all because a prisoner of war wrote home about ice cream. In the summer heat of Texas, the barracks smelled of pine wood and dust, and through the open windows came the faint rumble of trucks hauling grain to nearby silos. The prisoners, many of them still in patched uniforms from Africa or Normandy, blinked against the brightness of the southern sky. They had expected barbed wire and cruelty. Instead, they found order, routine, and something they could not reconcile with their expectations: abundance. Every day brought food, served on metal trays with portions that startled men who had grown used to watery soup and black bread. Eggs appeared at breakfast, fried or scrambled, with a side of bacon or oatmeal. Coffee was poured freely, strong and bitter but plentiful, filling tin cups again and again. Lunches offered meat, vegetables, and bread so soft and white that some German prisoners stared at it suspiciously, convinced it could not be real. And then, at least once a week, came the treat that would enter so many letters: ice cream. For Americans, ice cream was not remarkable. It was a product of an industrial system that had conquered logistics as thoroughly as it had conquered continents. Dairy cooperatives across the Midwest churned butter, cheese, and cream in volumes Europe could scarcely imagine. Refrigerated trucks, an invention still novel in the Old World, rumbled down highways delivering cold goods even in the heat of August. In towns near the camps, soda fountains were community hubs where soldiers and civilians alike ordered sundaes piled with whipped cream and cherries. For Americans, it was normal. For the prisoners, it was unthinkable. The contrast was brutal. In 1944, Germany, milk for children had become scarce. Sugar was rationed to grams per week. Butter had disappeared almost entirely from ordinary tables. Even before capture, many Wehrmacht soldiers had been gnawing on ersatz bread padded with sawdust or stretched with turnip flour. The men who arrived in American camps carried the hollow cheeks and thin frames of malnutrition. To sit down and find in front of them a bowl of ice cream drizzled with syrup, sometimes with fruit or chocolate, was almost surreal. Letters preserved from those months show the same astonishment repeated in different hands. "They even give us milk and ice cream," wrote one prisoner in Arkansas. "I thought it was a joke, but it is true." Another in Oklahoma told his wife, "Tell mother not to worry. They feed us better than our own army did." Imagine this. They gave us ice cream. It was more than a sweet. It was a revelation about America itself. Here was a country so rich, so industrially capable, that it could waste refrigeration and sugar on prisoners of war. Here was a system so confident in its abundance that it offered luxuries to men who had fought to destroy it. The prisoners began to realize that the Nazi propaganda machine, which had painted the United States as decadent and starving, was hollow. If the enemy could feed ice cream to captives, what else might they be capable of? The shock was not limited to Germans. Italian prisoners captured in North Africa or Sicily also marveled. Many had grown up with gelato as a summer indulgence, but wartime Italy had stripped even that from daily life. In American camps, they rediscovered the frozen sweetness and wrote home with irony. One letter preserved in an Italian archive simply read, "We lost the war, but here we eat ice cream." Another, "The fascists told us Americans were barbaric. These barbarians give us sundaes." Families who read those words could not help but compare them to Mussolini's slogans of sacrifice and struggle. What made the ice cream particularly powerful as a symbol was its triviality. No soldier risked punishment to smuggle a story about ice cream past a censor. No propagandist would invent such a detail. It was too absurd, too minor, too ordinary. And yet, for that very reason, it rang true. When mothers, wives, and neighbors gathered to hear these letters read aloud, they believed. They might doubt claims of fair treatment or question reports of medical care, but the mention of ice cream carried a ring of authenticity that nothing else could. Behind this abundance lay a massive industrial machine. The American dairy industry had expanded during the war to feed not only civilians but millions of servicemen overseas. Cans of powdered milk, tins of condensed cream, and blocks of butter moved across ocean. Factories at home churned out products for military rations and civilian markets alike. By 1944, the United States was producing over 20 billion pounds of milk annually, a figure unimaginable in wartime Europe. Some of that milk went into making ice cream, which had become both a comfort food and a symbol of normality for American soldiers. The military encouraged it, believing that ice cream raised morale. Floating ice cream barges were even stationed in the Pacific, producing thousands of gallons a day for sailors. It was only natural that some of this production spilled over into prisoner-of-war camps. Prisoners, astonished at this casual generosity, often misinterpreted it as a deliberate strategy. Rumors spread in camps that the Americans were trying to brainwash them, to soften them with luxuries so they would abandon loyalty to Germany. Some resisted, refusing the treat at first, but hunger and curiosity usually won. Within weeks, even the most skeptical were lining up, tin cups in hand, accepting scoops of vanilla or chocolate. And with every bite, their worldview shifted a little more. The letters carried these impressions across oceans. In bombed-out cities, families read them with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Some dismissed them as exaggerations, assuming their sons were trying to shield them from the truth. Others clung to them as proof that capture was not a death sentence. Either way, the detail lodged itself in memory. It was repeated in whispers at bakeries, in queues for rations, in churches after Sunday service. They give our boys ice cream. The Americans did not fully understand the impact. To them, it was routine provisioning, an extension of the same logistics that gave their own troops chocolate bars and Coca-Cola. But to the prisoners, it was transformative. The ice cream became a shorthand for America's astonishing resources, for its culture of abundance, and for a strange sort of humanity even in war. When historians decades later interviewed former POWs, many remembered not the punishments or the fences, but the first taste of ice cream in an American camp. One German recalled in an oral history, "It was strawberry, I think. I had not tasted strawberry since I was a child. I remember looking at the spoon and thinking, if this is war, then everything I have been told is wrong." Another remembered laughing with his bunkmates, the cold sweetness numbing their tongues while outside the Texas sun beat down. "It was absurd. We were enemies, and yet they fed us better than our own country." The symbolism only grew stronger with time. Memoirs published in the 1950s often mention ice cream in passing, as if it encapsulated the entire experience of captivity. Some wrote of it with humor, others with bitterness, others with gratitude. The detail became part of the shared memory of a generation. Even in post-war politics, former POWs who rose to office sometimes invoked those memories. They contrasted the abundance of America with the deprivation of home, using their own captivity as evidence of a broader truth. The United States had won not only through bombs and tanks, but through industry and plenty. The men in the camps did not know all this as they sat in their mess halls, tin spoons clinking against metal trays. They only knew that they were eating something rare and sweet, something that reminded them of childhood, something that made captivity less frightening. They laughed, they joked, they wrote letters. And in those letters, the detail that seemed least important at the time became the one that endured longest in memory. The paradox was striking. A war of steel and blood, of bombers and submarines, of firestorms and massacres, had one of its psychological turning points in something as small as a scoop of frozen cream. Yet that is how wars are won. Not just by breaking armies, but by breaking illusions. Not just by shattering defenses, but by showing another world exists. A world where abundance is normal, where kindness is possible, where even a prisoner can be offered dessert. And so the ice cream, casually served in American camps, became a quiet but potent weapon. It traveled across seas in letters, lodged itself in the minds of families, and eroded the lies on which entire regimes depended. When the prisoners handed their letters to censors, they did not intend to change the war. They only wanted to reassure their families. Yet with every mention of ice cream, they did just that. They reassured their loved ones, and at the same time, they undermined the propaganda that had kept those loved ones obedient. That is why historians looking back have called the letters from POWs one of the most underestimated forces in the collapse of German morale. They carried not just words, but truths too small to be doubted. Truths that slipped past censors and crashed into living rooms across Europe like tiny grenades of reality. And at the heart of those truths, absurdly and powerfully, was ice cream. The rhythm of captivity settled quickly, though it never lost its strangeness. Each camp became its own small world, ruled by schedules, punctuated by whistles and bugle calls, defined by fences but also by routines. Morning began with roll call, men lining up in dusty yards while guards marked names against rosters. Breakfast followed, served in long mess halls where the noise of tin cups and spoons echoed like an orchestra of metal. The food was the prisoners' constant subject of comparison. Many had marched across Europe on empty stomachs, stealing from farm fields or subsisting on thin stews. In America, they found themselves confronted with regular meals, sometimes repetitive but astonishingly filling. Bread was soft and white, margarine spreadable, coffee poured endlessly from large urns. On some mornings, cereal appeared, sweetened with sugar, something unheard of back home. For men who had long lived with scarcity, the sheer normality of American abundance was shocking. After breakfast came work details. International law allowed prisoners to be used for non-military labor, and the United States, facing shortages at home, put them to use. Trucks ferried groups to nearby farms, sawmills, or construction projects. The prisoners hoed cotton, picked peaches, mended fences, dug ditches, and sometimes helped repair roads. It was exhausting work, but compared to forced marches under fire or labor in bombed-out factories, it felt almost merciful. Farmers often treated them with wary kindness. In the fields of the Midwest, old men tipped their hats, and farm women brought water or even baked pies. For many prisoners, this was their first close contact with American civilians, and it puzzled them deeply. Propaganda had taught them to expect hatred. Instead, they found a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and sometimes surprising warmth. Evenings in camp carried their own rhythm. After supper, prisoners drifted into activities organized by the camp or improvised by themselves. Some played soccer on makeshift fields. Others gathered in barracks to sing or carve wood. Guitars and harmonicas appeared, their music drifting into the night. Education became another pillar of camp life. American authorities, influenced by the Geneva Convention and by their own belief in re-education, encouraged classes. Barracks were converted into classrooms where volunteer instructors, sometimes prisoners themselves, taught languages, mathematics, engineering, or literature. The YMCA and the Red Cross supplied textbooks, and chalkboards hung on rough wooden walls. Men who had once marched under swastikas now found themselves solving algebra problems or reading Shakespeare in translation. It was not lost on them that their captors, even in war, provided books instead of chains. The letters home reflected these rhythms. They spoke of food and health, but also of work in fields, of schooling, of sports. The censors allowed these details, judging them harmless. Yet each letter painted a picture starkly at odds with the radio broadcasts back in Europe. When a mother read that her son had spent the day picking cotton under a wide blue sky, she compared it unconsciously to the gray ruins of her own city. When a wife read that her husband was attending English classes in camp, she wondered why the regime told her America was barbaric. When a neighbor heard that prisoners played soccer matches watched by guards who cheered good plays, he laughed and shook his head. The gulf between propaganda and reality widened with each description. The psychological effect deepened as seasons passed. Winter brought warmth the prisoners did not expect. Stoves filled with coal, blankets issued freely, hot meals even in the coldest weeks. Spring brought flowers blooming outside the fences, fields alive with crops the prisoners helped cultivate. Summer brought long evenings, sometimes punctuated by dances organized by American soldiers where music spilled into the night, and astonished Germans or Italians watched their captors swing and jitterbug. These small windows into American life were more than entertainment. They were revelations. They showed a culture not defined by slogans, but by ordinary joys, by abundance, by a kind of casual freedom that many had never known. Some prisoners resisted clinging to ideology. They formed cliques, muttered against collaborators, tried to enforce discipline in barracks. But even they could not prevent the slow seep of perception. A man could not eat ice cream twice a week and still believe America was starving. A man could not watch a guard hand him a cigarette and still believe Americans were cruel savages. A man could not attend classes with books freely offered and still believe the enemy wanted only his destruction. The contradictions eroded certainty. There are accounts of prisoners writing letters filled with coded defiance, trying to reassure families of their loyalty. But even in those letters, small cracks appeared. A line about food too plentiful to finish, a note about shoes issued in good condition, an aside about medical care. Families read between the lines. They saw what was not said as clearly as what was, and what they saw did not match the broadcast that blared from radios in their kitchens. Over time, the rhythm of camp life created its own kind of normalcy. Men built friendships across national lines, Germans and Italians trading songs or stories, even befriending American guards. Some camps published their own newspapers, handwritten or mimeographed, filled with essays, jokes, and poems. One camp in Texas produced a satirical paper that mocked both Nazi propaganda and American stereotypes, a strange hybrid humor that showed how much distance the prisoners had traveled from their old certainties. Even the act of joking about propaganda was itself a betrayal of its power. The ice cream remained a constant touchstone. It was not served daily, but its presence lingered in memory. Men marked Sundays by whether the canteen offered it. Some pooled work pay, small allowances given for labor, to buy extra portions. They described flavors with the precision of gourmets. noting vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. For men starved of sugar, each scoop was both luxury and symbol. They wrote about it again and again, and families reading their words could not ignore the implication. America was so abundant, it could give dessert to its enemies. Historians examining these letters decades later found patterns. They noticed that food dominated the narrative, but that within food, sweets stood out. Ice cream was mentioned disproportionately, far more than meat or bread. The conclusion was simple. Sweets carried emotional weight. They spoke of childhood, of innocence, of comfort. To write home about ice cream was to signal not only survival, but a kind of rebirth, a reminder that joy existed even in captivity. For American authorities, much of this was unintentional. The camps were designed for order and efficiency, not for cultural diplomacy. But the effect was undeniable. By treating prisoners in accordance with international law, and by supplying them with the abundance America could easily afford, the United States had created a living contradiction to enemy propaganda. Each camp was a message in itself. Fences contained the men, but within them life was orderly, humane, even unexpectedly generous. And each letter home carried that message outward, echoing across Europe, whispered from family to family, until it spread further than any official broadcast could. The rhythm of captivity, then, was more than routine. It was a slow transformation, a daily chipping away at illusions. It was the replacement of fear with astonishment, of suspicion with doubt, of hostility with curiosity. It was the slow realization, repeated thousands of times, that the enemy was not what they had been told. And at the center of that realization, absurdly but undeniably, was something as simple as ice cream in a mess hall on a hot American afternoon. By the autumn of 1944, the prisoners had begun to write home with a different tone in their letters. At first, the words had been cautious, stiff, and formal, still echoing the rigid discipline of the armies they had served. But as weeks became months, the lines softened. They contained not only reassurances of health and survival, but also vivid descriptions of life that none of their families could have imagined. A man from Hamburg described a farm in Kansas where he was sent to pick corn, marveling at the endless fields and the kindness of the farmer's wife who gave him coffee and pie. Another, captured in North Africa and shipped to a camp in Texas, told of the music drifting from radios in nearby towns, strange rhythms unlike anything he had heard at home. And again, woven through the letters like a refrain, came the mention of ice cream. At first it had been an astonishment, an exclamation of disbelief. Now it became part of the rhythm of captivity, a detail repeated so often that it took on symbolic weight. The prisoners compared notes among themselves. In barracks, men passed around postcards, showing each other what they had written, laughing at the similarities. One would point to a line, "They gave us ice cream again." Another would nod and say, "I wrote the same thing." It became almost a ritual, a way of signaling to families that they were not only alive, but also living in a world that contradicted everything they had been told. In some camps, the men even joked that the Americans were waging war with ice cream, scooping away their loyalty one spoonful at a time. The jokes masked something deeper, a recognition that their perceptions were shifting, that their sense of the enemy was being quietly dismantled. The guards noticed it too. American officers reported that discipline in the camps improved when prisoners felt well-fed and treated fairly. Acts of defiance became rare. Escape attempts dwindled. The occasional outbreaks of tension usually came not from harsh treatment, but from ideological battles among the prisoners themselves, particularly when die-hard Nazis tried to maintain control over their comrades. But even those men could not silence the steady stream of letters filled with small but undeniable truths. One German corporal, interviewed decades later, remembered the effect vividly. "I was captured in Normandy. We were told the Americans would kill us. Then we were put on a train, given food, and brought to a camp in Georgia. I thought it was a trick, but when I wrote my first letter home, I told my wife that they gave us good bread and even ice cream. She later told me that when she read those words, she no longer believed anything the radio said. That single line, preserved in her memory for decades, had undermined years of propaganda. The Americans did not fully intend this. They were following the Geneva Convention, ensuring order in their camps, and applying the vast resources of a nation that had not known invasion or famine. But the result was a form of psychological warfare more powerful than any leaflet drop. The letters were authentic because they were personal. They bypassed suspicion because they were too trivial to be lies. And they reached the heart of the matter. The simple fact that America, even in war, possessed abundance. The prisoners themselves could feel the dissonance. They had fought for a regime that demanded sacrifice, that glorified hardship, that told them the Allies were weak and decadent. Now they lived among evidence to the contrary. The decadence, if one wished to call it that, was comforting rather than corrupting. It manifested not in chaos but in order, not in cruelty but in generosity. The men argued among themselves late into the night, trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what they saw. Some insisted it was a trick, that the Americans were fattening them up for propaganda purposes. Others, more pragmatic, shrugged and said, "If this is decadence, I prefer it." Work outside the camps deepened the impression. On farms, prisoners labored alongside civilians, who often treated them with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. In one report from Iowa, a farmer's daughter recalled how the German workers in her family's field stared in amazement when she brought them lemonade and sandwiches. They said they had never been given food while working, she remembered. At home, they had to steal from fields if they were hungry. Such encounters found their way into letters, too, further undermining the image of America as a cruel oppressor. Even the smallest gestures took on enormous significance. Cigarettes, distributed cheaply in American camps, were passed around with casual generosity. Soap, plentiful and fragrant, contrasted with the shortages back home. Shoes, jackets, and blankets were issued without fuss. The prisoners, accustomed to scarcity, marveled at how these things seemed inexhaustible. And so, when they wrote home, they filled their lines with details that seemed absurd in the context of Germany's collapsing cities. They wrote of showers with hot water, of libraries with English books, of canteens where ice cream appeared regularly. Families, hearing these words, compared them with their own reality of bombed-out apartments, meager rations, and constant fear. The conclusion was unavoidable. The world they had been told to hate was, in fact, a world of comfort and plenty. By late 1944, the pattern was clear. The more letters circulated, the more disbelief in Nazi propaganda spread. In Cologne and Hamburg, in small villages in Bavaria, in the industrial towns of the Ruhr, families whispered to one another, "Our boys say they are well treated." It was dangerous talk, but it spread anyway. The letters were proof, carried in familiar handwriting, sealed with the authenticity of personal experience. Neighbors shared them secretly, and entire communities began to doubt the official narrative. Some German officials knew the danger. Reports to Berlin mentioned the problem of prisoner letters undermining morale. Attempts were made to dismiss them as fabrications, claiming that the Americans forced prisoners to lie. But the claim rang hollow. Families knew the rhythms of their sons' words. They recognized idioms, inside jokes, private references. A forced script could not replicate such things. And so the propaganda machine sputtered, unable to counter the quiet power of thousands of small, ordinary truths. In retrospect, historians see this as one of the most underestimated aspects of the war. The United States did not win only with bombers and tanks. It won with the perception of abundance, carried across the Atlantic in envelopes. Ice cream, bread, cigarettes, these were not weapons in the traditional sense, yet they worked with astonishing effect. They convinced families that surrender was survivable, even preferable. They eroded faith in leaders who promised only sacrifice and struggle. They planted seeds of doubt that grew into quiet resistance. For the prisoners themselves, the letters became lifelines. Writing about food and comfort reassured their families, but it also reassured them. Putting words on paper turned their own astonishment into a record, confirming that what they were experiencing was real. Years later, many recalled the act of writing as a moment of relief, a chance to assert their humanity in the face of defeat. One remembered, "I wrote about the ice cream not because it was important in itself, but because it proved I was not in hell. It proved life continued, even for us." As 1945 approached, the rhythm intensified. More men were captured, more camps opened, more letters sent. Each one was a drop of truth in an ocean of lies. And as the war ground toward its end, those drops accumulated into a tide that even the most hardened propagandists could not stop. The irony remained profound. A war that consumed millions of lives, that unleashed horrors across continents, was chipped away at by something as trivial as dessert. But in that triviality lay its power. Ice cream was not just a taste. It was a symbol of everything Germany could not provide, everything the regime had denied its people, everything the enemy possessed in abundance. To write home about it was to say, "The world is not as you have been told." To read about it was to realize, the enemy is not who we thought. And in that realization, quietly and inexorably, the war began to be lost long before the final surrender. Winter of 1944 settled over the camps with a kind of silence the prisoners had not known in years. They were far from the front, far from artillery, far from the crash of bombs. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on frost, the whistle of guards calling roll, and the steady hum of life inside wooden barracks. Snow fell across Texas, across Arkansas, across the plains of Kansas, light but steady. And for men who had expected hardship, it brought not suffering but a strange reminder of normal seasons. Fires burned in pot-bellied stoves, filling rooms with dry heat. Blankets were issued in numbers that astonished men who remembered sleeping under a single threadbare coat on the Russian steppe. Food did not diminish. Even in the coldest months, the kitchens produced meals of meat, vegetables, and bread. Sometimes, after supper, the canteen opened its doors, and prisoners were served bowls of ice cream, so cold in their hands that steam rose as the winter air touched the metal trays. Letters written in those months show the amazement clearly. A young soldier from Bavaria told his mother, "We have enough to eat, and even in the snow they gave us ice cream. I cannot explain it. We are prisoners, and yet we eat as kings." Another, held in a camp in Oklahoma, described his first Christmas in captivity, a meal with turkey, potatoes, cake, and, to his astonishment, ice cream for dessert. "It is not home," he wrote, "but it is life, and I live." Families who read such words must have stared at the lines in disbelief. In the ruins of Cologne, Berlin, or Munich, winter meant hunger. Coal was scarce, bread was rationed, meat was a memory. And here, their captured sons wrote of abundance, of luxuries beyond imagination. The effect of these letters was magnified by the contrast with rumors of the Eastern Front. Everyone in Germany knew that soldiers captured by the Soviets often vanished. Letters stopped, names disappeared, and whispers of starvation and camps in Siberia circulated in hushed voices. Against that background, the letters from America shone like lanterns in the dark. A mother might lose one son in Russia, with no word, no grave, no closure, and receive from another son in America a letter describing ice cream on Christmas Day. The emotional impact was indescribable. It was not just relief, it was revelation. Inside the camps, life took on rhythms that blended captivity with unexpected freedom. Work details continued through the winter. Prisoners cut timber in nearby forests, shoveled snow from rural roads, and helped repair barns. Farmers and townspeople saw them bundled in coats, working methodically, guarded but not abused. Some civilians began to speak to them, cautiously at first, then more openly. In Minnesota, a farmer remembered handing hot coffee to shivering Germans who had just cleared his field. "They were boys," he said later, "no different from ours." The Germans, stunned by the kindness, wrote home about it too. They told of American civilians who shared food, of farmers' wives who pressed apples into their hands, of children who waved shyly from fences. Each story undermined years of propaganda that had painted America as savage and merciless. The education programs expanded during winter months, when outdoor work was limited. Barracks turned into classrooms lit by kerosene lamps. Prisoners studied English, mathematics, engineering, and history. American instructors, some civilian volunteers, others soldiers, guided lessons. The Red Cross provided dictionaries and textbooks. Men who had been factory workers or farmers found themselves reading Shakespeare or learning algebra. They wrote home about it with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "I am learning English from books they give us," wrote one prisoner. "They treat us as if we were students, not enemies." Such lines, permitted by censors, carried another shock to families in Europe. The Americans not only fed their captives, but educated them. Cultural encounters grew more frequent as well. American soldiers often had radios, and their music drifted across camp fences. Country songs, swing, and jazz filled the evenings. At first, the prisoners found the rhythms strange, but soon they tapped feet and hummed along. Sometimes prisoners with musical training were allowed instruments. Violins, accordions, and harmonicas appeared. Joint concerts emerged, Americans playing their tunes, Germans answering with their own folk songs. It was not propaganda. It was spontaneous, unplanned, born of boredom and humanity. Yet when letters described these events, they struck European families with startling force. They even let us play music, one wrote. We sang with them. It is unbelievable. The most persistent symbol remained ice cream. In Europe, winter made such a treat impossible. Milk was scarce, sugar nearly absent, and cold was not luxury, but survival. To hear that their sons ate ice cream in December, under guard yet unharmed, stunned families. Some thought it was a code, a hidden message. Others took it literally and marveled. Either way, it spread disbelief in official stories. Propaganda said Americans were cruel. The letters said Americans gave ice cream in winter. Which to believe? The guards themselves became part of the story. Many were young Americans from rural states, scarcely older than the prisoners they watched. Some struck up cautious conversations, sharing cigarettes or explaining baseball. Others simply treated the men with calm professionalism. The contrast with the feared Gestapo or SS discipline could not have been sharper. Prisoners wrote home about guards who joked, who carried photographs of their families, who treated them as men rather than beasts. These accounts, small and personal, carried devastating weight in Germany. They showed that the enemy was human, even kind. Psychologists later noted that the prisoners experienced what they called cognitive dissonance. They had believed one thing, that Americans were decadent, cruel, corrupt. They now saw another, Americans who provided food, warmth, even ice cream. The clash between expectation and reality forced them to reconsider not only their captors, but their own regime. Doubt crept in, quiet but unstoppable. The letters became the evidence of that doubt, carried into homes where propaganda could not erase them. By early 1945, as the Reich crumbled, the stream of letters continued. Families read them with tears, holding on to the only good news they had. Even as bombs fell, even as cities burned, they heard from their sons across the ocean, "We are alive, we are fed, we have even tasted ice cream." For some, those letters were the first glimpse of a different world, a world not defined by scarcity and terror. For others, they were the beginning of a new way of thinking about America itself. Looking back decades later, former prisoners remembered the winter of 1944 to 45 with a kind of disbelief. "I could not understand it," one said in an interview. "I thought I would die in captivity. Instead, they gave me ice cream at Christmas." Another, an Italian soldier captured in North Africa, recalled laughing as snow fell outside the barracks while he held a spoonful of vanilla ice cream. "It was absurd," he said. "Absurd and unforgettable." What mattered most was not the ice cream itself, but what it represented: abundance, humanity, contradiction. It told prisoners that America was strong enough to give luxuries even to its enemies. It told families that propaganda had lied. It told both sides that the world was larger, stranger, and perhaps kinder than they had been led to believe. And as the war drew to its bloody conclusion, those small, sweet moments carried a power out of all proportion to their size. Spring came early in 1945, and with it the slow unraveling of everything the prisoners had once believed. The snow melted around the camps, streams of mud tracing lines through gravel paths, and green shoots pushed up beyond the fences. Life in captivity moved forward with a rhythm that had become almost ordinary. But beneath that ordinariness was a growing sense of astonishment. Every day confirmed that the world outside the Reich's propaganda was larger, freer, and stranger than they had been told. The letters they wrote in those months carried not only the usual reassurances of survival, but also descriptions that bordered on the surreal to their families back home. They wrote of working in fields where farmers' children waved and sometimes slipped apples into their hands. They wrote of classes in English and mathematics that felt more like opportunities than punishments. They wrote of seeing moving pictures shown in camp recreation halls, American films with cowboy heroes and comic actors that brought bursts of laughter to men who had not laughed in years. And always, threaded through like a refrain, they wrote of ice cream. It was no longer just a treat. It had become a symbol of everything captivity in America represented. In Europe, spring of 1945 was hunger. Bread lines stretched for blocks, coal was gone, and families foraged for weeds and potato peelings. In the United States, Prisoners described walking into canteens and being handed bowls of cold cream, flavored with chocolate or fruit, served casually, as if such abundance was normal. Families who read those words could scarcely comprehend them. Some assumed it was exaggeration. Others believed wholeheartedly and spread the news to neighbors. In both cases, the impact was the same. Doubt. Doubt about what the regime said. Doubt about the official image of the enemy. Doubt that sustained loyalty when defeat seemed inevitable. The camps themselves became laboratories of perception. In barracks, prisoners argued late into the night about what it all meant. Die-hard loyalists claimed it was all a trick, a propaganda trap meant to soften them for re-education. Others shook their heads and pointed to the evidence: the food, the books, the music, the laughter of guards who treated them without cruelty. "If this is a trick," one prisoner reportedly said, "then I prefer the trick to the truth we had." Such conversations found their way into letters, too. Not in direct political terms, those would have been censored, but in the tone, the details, the choice of what to describe. A wife in Hamburg received a letter in which her husband mentioned that he was studying English grammar. Another in Munich read her son's words: "I am playing football with Americans. They let us win sometimes." A mother in Stuttgart held a page that said simply, "We are fed. We even have ice cream. Believe me, it is true." As defeat loomed for Germany, these letters became lifelines not only of hope, but of truth. They offered glimpses into a world where enemies acted with humanity, where life went on with routines that seemed impossible in bombed-out cities. The sheer ordinariness described in the letters was itself extraordinary. A German officer in a camp in Louisiana wrote of spring planting, "We worked alongside Negro laborers in the fields. They laughed and one shared his lunch with me." Imagine that. Food shared with a German prisoner. The line was almost explosive in its implications. At home, propaganda had insisted on racial hierarchies, on the superiority of the Aryan soldier. Here was the same soldier confessing that an American farmhand had shown him kindness that defied all such categories. His family, reading the words, could not fail to notice the contradiction. The contradictions multiplied. Some letters described medical care that rivaled anything the soldiers had received at home. A prisoner with a toothache was taken to a dentist in town, treated without charge, and returned to camp with pain gone. Another described being vaccinated against typhus, marveling that the enemy cared enough to protect his health. Families who read these accounts compared them to their own struggles to find doctors, to secure medicine, to keep children alive in a collapsing state. The gap was so vast that disbelief gave way to something else: longing. Within the camps, the rhythms of life deepened. Soccer leagues were organized, with prisoners divided into teams that competed for bragging rights. Art classes flourished, with men painting landscapes of the Texas plains or the rolling hills of Arkansas. Some of these paintings were later sent home, folded into envelopes alongside letters, showing families not only words, but images of a world beyond their understanding. One painting preserved in an archive shows prisoners eating ice cream under a blazing American sun, their expressions caught between disbelief and delight. Whether intended as humor or simple record, it conveyed more than pages of description could. The guards, too, noticed the change. Reports noted that morale among prisoners remained high, discipline steady, and escape attempts rare. Commanders concluded that humane treatment was not only right, but effective. The more comfortable the men were, the more orderly the camps became. And the more they wrote home about that comfort, the more the enemy's morale abroad eroded. It was an unintended but undeniable weapon of war. A guard in one camp later recalled, "I realized that every letter they sent was another bullet against Hitler. Not a bullet that killed, but one that killed lies." Among the prisoners, a new kind of reflection began. Some started to question not only propaganda, but the choices that had led them to war. One man wrote in his diary, "If they treat us so, why did we believe they were monsters? Why did we fight?" He did not send those words home. Censors would have struck them out, but the sentiment grew. After the war, many former prisoners recalled that their first doubts about the regime came not from Allied bombs or speeches, but from the experience of captivity itself. The ice cream, absurd as it seemed, became a symbol of that doubt, a wedge that opened larger cracks in their worldview. Back in Europe, families shared these letters in whispers. Neighbors gathered in kitchens, in church halls, even in bomb shelters, passing around sheets of thin paper covered in familiar handwriting. They marveled at the details: food, warmth, music, medical care, and again, ice cream. They contrasted it with their own reality: hunger, cold, silence, fear. Each letter was a window into another world, one where abundance reigned and enemies behaved with humanity. The impact was cumulative. No single letter toppled faith in propaganda, but together they eroded it relentlessly. By the time spring turned to summer in 1945, the war was nearly lost for Germany. Yet in thousands of homes, families held on to letters that had already told them what the regime would not admit. Their sons were alive, their captors were humane, and the world outside was not as they had been told. The letters had done their work. They had reassured, comforted, and most importantly, revealed. When historians later pieced together the cultural history of captivity, they found these letters to be among the most important sources. They showed not only how prisoners experienced captivity, but also how those experiences were transmitted across oceans and into the hearts of families. They revealed how small details like ice cream in a camp canteen could shake belief systems more powerfully than bombs. They proved that propaganda could be undone not only by military defeat, but by lived reality. For the prisoners, the spring of 1945 was a season of contradictions. They remained captives, surrounded by fences and guards. Yet within those fences, they experienced comforts, kindness, and even joys that their families at home could not imagine. They lived between two worlds, the ruined Reich collapsing behind them and the abundance of America surrounding them. And in their letters, they tried to bridge that gap, to put into words what seemed impossible. Again and again, they returned to the same refrain, the same proof, the same symbol. They wrote, "We even have ice cream." By the summer of 1945, the camps no longer felt temporary. The fences still stood, the towers still loomed, the guards still walked their patrols, but the prisoners had settled into a rhythm that sometimes felt closer to community than captivity. Gardens bloomed between barracks, tended by men who had once marched through burning cities. Soccer fields were marked out more carefully, with goalposts hammered together from scrap wood. The education programs had matured into fully fledged schools, with timetables, textbooks, even examinations. And the canteens continued their steady miracle of provision, offering soap, tobacco, stationery, and astonishingly, ice cream. For many prisoners, this had ceased to be a novelty and become a marker of continuity, a sign that even as the war ended and the world shifted, some things remained constant. They ate ice cream in summer heat, as they had the summer before, and they wrote home about it with the same mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The letters written in that period reveal a new tone. Where once they were cautious, tentative, filled with shock, they now often carried reflection. A man from Bremen told his wife, "When I first arrived, I thought every kindness was a trick. Now I see it is simply how they live. We are treated with a generosity I still cannot explain. They even give us ice cream, as if it costs them nothing." Another prisoner wrote to his parents in Stuttgart, "If I had not seen it myself, I would never believe it. Children at home go hungry, but here in captivity they give us sweets. What does this say about the world we thought we knew?" These words, preserved in archives, carried profound implications. They were not only reassurances of survival, they were confessions of doubt, admissions that the old certainties had collapsed. For American authorities, the camps were winding down. Victory in Europe was complete, Japan's defeat approaching, and the question of repatriation loomed. But until the ships were ready, the camps remained full. Officers sought to keep order by maintaining routines, and routine meant food, work, education, and recreation. The ice cream, mundane to Americans, had by now become an unintentional instrument of cultural diplomacy. Reports noted how often prisoners wrote home about it, how frequently families back in Germany repeated it. Without design, without policy, it had become a symbol of American abundance and humanity. Inside the camps, prisoners themselves began to discuss the future. What would happen when they returned? How would they explain what they had seen? Many admitted they dreaded being disbelieved. How could they describe to families who had lived through starvation that they had eaten well in captivity? How could they tell children who had known only substitutes that they had been given ice cream by the enemy? Some resolved to keep quiet, ashamed of their relative comfort. Others swore they would tell the truth no matter how bitter it sounded. Still others joked that their families would never forgive them for having tasted luxury while they starved. In some camps, officers encouraged prisoners to think about rebuilding. They arranged lectures on democracy, on civic responsibility, even on agriculture and industry. The goal was not indoctrination but preparation, an attempt to shape men who would one day help reconstruct a shattered continent. Letters from this period often mention these programs. "They give us books and lectures," wrote one man, "and they tell us it is to prepare us for freedom." Imagine that, preparing prisoners for freedom. Combined with the simple abundance of food, these messages carried devastating weight against the propaganda of the regime that had collapsed only weeks before. Families reading them could not fail to see the contrast between what the Reich had promised and what it had delivered. The irony deepened when prisoners compared their own condition with news of Germany's devastation. Word filtered into the camps of bombed cities, of hunger and displacement, of millions of civilians searching for shelter. Some prisoners wept openly upon hearing of their families' suffering. Others sat in stunned silence. To eat ice cream in a canteen while knowing that one's children scrounged for scraps in ruins was almost unbearable. Yet it also crystallized the truth. The war had been lost not only on the battlefield, but in the very ability to sustain life. The United States could feed its enemies in abundance, while Germany could not feed its own people. That fact was impossible to ignore, and it shaped not only the prisoners' perceptions, but also the letters they wrote. A letter from a camp in Colorado, written in August 1945, captures this poignantly. "My dear wife, I cannot explain to you what it is like here. We have food in plenty, and last night I ate ice cream while thinking of you. Forgive me for writing this, for I know how hungry you must be. But I must tell the truth. They treat us well, and they provide things I never expected. I pray for the day I can share such things with you." The censors allowed it, perhaps not realizing the power of the words. But when that letter reached its destination, it spread beyond the household, passed from neighbor to neighbor, as proof that the enemy was not only humane, but wealthier, stronger, and more capable than their own regime had ever been. The guards, too, were aware of the dissonance. Some expressed sympathy, others simple professionalism. One American sergeant later recalled, "We knew their families were starving back home, and here we were, serving them ice cream. It seemed crazy, but it was how the system worked. We had more than enough, and we followed the rules. I think they respected us for it." That respect became another thread in the narrative of the letters. Prisoners wrote not only of food, but of guards who acted with fairness, of officers who kept order without cruelty, of a system that functioned with efficiency and humanity. For families raised on stories of American barbarity, these accounts were nothing short of astonishing. By late 1945, many prisoners began to return home. They boarded ships in New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans, clutching duffel bags filled with handmade souvenirs, books, and the bundles of letters they had received in captivity. On the voyage, they reread their own words, marveling at what they had written months before. Some laughed at the constant mention of ice cream. Others realized that those lines had carried truths more powerful than they had understood at the time. When they reached Europe, they stepped into landscapes of rubble and hunger. Their families embraced them with tears and disbelief, and often the first conversations turned to those letters. "Did you really have ice cream?" mothers asked. "Was it true?" And the returning prisoners, weary and gaunt but alive, nodded. "Yes," they said, "it was true." In the years that followed, those memories hardened into symbols. Memoirs published in the 1950s and 1960s often mention ice cream in captivity, not because it was important in itself, but because it represented the collapse of illusion. It stood for abundance, for kindness, for the vast difference between propaganda and reality. Museums in the United States later displayed artifacts from the camps: spoons, bowls, menus, even ice cream tokens from PX stores. Visitors laughed at first, but curators explained the deeper meaning. For the prisoners, that dessert had carried a message more powerful than any speech. The enemy had treated them with humanity in a time when their own leaders had betrayed them. Thus, by the end of 1945, the narrative was set. The war was over, the prisoners returned. But the letters they had written continued to circulate, tucked into drawers, tied with ribbons, read and reread by families who remembered their shock. They had carried not just reassurance, but revelation. They had undermined propaganda with trivial truths. They had shown that the world was not as the Reich had claimed. And at the heart of those truths, absurdly but indelibly, was the fact that even in captivity, on hot summer days in distant America, they had been given ice cream. When the war finally ended, the camps did not empty all at once. Repatriation was a slow and uneven process, governed by shipping schedules, diplomatic agreements, and the practical needs of rebuilding Europe. Some prisoners boarded ships as early as the summer of 1945. Others remained into 1946, even 1947, working on farms or in sawmills as laborers until transport became available. They lived with a constant paradox. They longed to go home, yet home was a land of ruins, while captivity meant safety, food, and routine. Letters from this period carry a strange tension, half relief and half guilt. A man from Dusseldorf wrote to his wife, "They tell us we will go home soon. I dream of it every night. But I also know that here I am fed, and you are not. Yesterday they gave us ice cream. How can I write that when you have nothing? Forgive me." His words captured the contradiction of post-war captivity. Comfort in enemy hands, despair for families in ruins. For the families who received these letters, the emotions were complex. Relief that their sons lived, bitterness that they ate while children starved, astonishment that the enemy treated them better than their own government had. The letters circulated in neighborhoods like contraband, read aloud in kitchens and cellars, whispered among women standing in ration lines. "They feed them better than us," people said. "They give them ice cream while we queue for turnips." Such comparisons sharpened the sense of betrayal, undermining not only wartime propaganda, but also the legitimacy of the regime that had collapsed. The truth was undeniable, carried in familiar handwriting across oceans. The prisoners themselves struggled with these feelings. Some felt shame when describing abundance. They worried their families would resent them. Others felt compelled to tell the truth, to record their astonishment. A prisoner in Texas wrote, "I cannot hide it. We have food enough, even luxuries. We even have ice cream. I know it must wound you to read this, but I want you to know that life is possible outside what we have known." Such lines reveal how captivity transformed not only daily experience but worldviews. Men who had believed the world was a battlefield of enemies discovered instead that generosity existed even in war. When the men finally returned, they carried duffel bags filled with odd souvenirs. Some brought wooden carvings made in camp workshops. Others carried notebooks filled with sketches, dictionaries used in English classes, or books borrowed from YMCA libraries. Many carried bundles of letters tied with string, fragile sheets covered in their own handwriting, preserved like relics. These letters became heirlooms, passed down through families, evidence of survival and transformation. In small towns across Germany, Austria, and Italy, drawers still hold them today. Pages that mention not battles or ideology, but food, kindness, and ice cream. Historians later studied these documents with fascination. They saw in them not only the resilience of the human spirit, but also the collapse of propaganda. Here were ordinary men, soldiers of defeated armies, writing with astonishment about abundance in captivity. Their words did what Allied leaflets and broadcasts often failed to do. They convinced families that the enemy was not monstrous. They showed that another world existed, one of plenty and humanity. And because they were personal, handwritten, unmistakably authentic, they carried weight that no official source could match. Memoirs published in the 1950s often mention these moments. Former prisoners recalled the first time they ate ice cream, the laughter in barracks, the incredulous letters home. Some wrote with humor, others with solemnity, but all recognized the symbolism. One officer remembered, "I knew the war was truly lost when I saw that they could give ice cream to prisoners while our cities starved." Another wrote, "The first thing I told my family on my return was not about battles, but about ice cream. It was the symbol of everything we had misunderstood." These recollections show how deeply the trivial detail had lodged in memory. In the post-war years, as Germany rebuilt and Italy struggled with its own scars, the former prisoners carried with them impressions that shaped politics and culture. Many had seen democracy in action, however faintly, in the way camps were organized. They had attended classes, read books, and debated ideas forbidden at home. They had eaten foods that symbolized abundance, and they had written letters that contradicted propaganda. When they became citizens again, they brought those experiences with them. Some became teachers, some politicians, some businessmen. In their memoirs and interviews, they often credited captivity with broadening their horizons. "We learned more about democracy in an American camp than we ever did under Hitler," one man said. Another recalled, "Ice cream taught me more about America than any speech." It showed me they could afford kindness. Museums in the United States later displayed artifacts from these camps. In Aliceville, Alabama and Hereford, Texas, local historical societies gathered letters, carvings, photographs, and even spoons used in mess halls. Visitors laughed at first when they saw references to ice cream, but curators explained the deeper meaning. For the prisoners, it had been the ultimate symbol of abundance, a detail that shattered illusions. School children listened as guides explained how something so small could alter perceptions of entire nations. The ice cream served in those camps became part of the cultural memory of the war, not because of its taste, but because of its meaning. Oral histories recorded in the 1980s and 1990s capture these memories in the voices of elderly men. One Italian prisoner interviewed in Georgia chuckled as he said, "I was 22 when I tasted ice cream for the first time. Imagine that, 22 and in captivity. I will never forget it." A German veteran, his voice cracked with age, recalled, "I wrote my mother that they gave us ice cream. She said later that when she read that, she stopped believing the radio. That was the moment she knew we had been lied to." These testimonies confirm what historians suspected, that the smallest details could undermine entire regimes of deception. For the prisoners, the memory endured not only because of the food itself, but because of what it represented: survival, humanity, and the collapse of illusion. In captivity, they had discovered a world of abundance, and through their letters, they had carried that discovery back to families who desperately needed hope. They had not intended to become agents of truth, but that is what they became. Each mention of ice cream was a quiet declaration that reality was larger and kinder than propaganda allowed. Each letter was a seed of doubt planted in the hearts of families across a devastated continent. Thus, as the camps emptied and men returned to shattered homes, the story of ice cream traveled with them. It entered kitchens, living rooms, schools, and eventually museums. It became part of the collective memory of a generation that had endured war and discovered humanity in captivity. It showed that even in the darkest times, small details could carry enormous weight. And it proved that sometimes the simplest things, a scoop of ice cream, a line in a letter, could help reshape the way nations saw each other. The legacy of those letters did not end with the prisoners themselves. Their families preserved them, tucked into drawers, folded in boxes, hidden between the pages of family Bibles. They became evidence not just of survival, but of revelation. Generations later, grandchildren would open those boxes and find their grandfather's handwriting, describing not bombs or battles, but ice cream, and they would marvel at the detail. What did it mean that in captivity their ancestors had discovered abundance and humanity? What did it mean that ice cream could topple lies more effectively than speeches or leaflets? The letters became stories told at family tables, anecdotes passed down as part of family lore. They became part of the way memory worked, shaping how descendants understood the war and their place in it. The significance of this is easy to underestimate. It was only ice cream after all, yet within its soft texture and sweet taste was a revelation that the enemy had resources so vast that even prisoners could receive luxuries, and that generosity could exist where cruelty was expected. In that revelation lay the undoing of years of propaganda. Goebbels had thundered that America was decadent, chaotic, incapable of sacrifice. Yet letters described not chaos but order, not deprivation but plenty, not brutality but surprising kindness. Each cone, each scoop, each casual serving line in a camp was a direct contradiction of 1,000 speeches. And because it came not from outsiders but from sons and brothers, it could not be dismissed. The Red Cross, the YMCA, and American camp administrators never imagined the symbolic weight of their choices. They provided ice cream because it was easy to make, because milk and sugar were abundant, because machines stood ready in towns across the South and Midwest. To them, it was a way to use resources, to keep morale up, to bring a touch of normalcy to soldiers and captives alike. They did not know that each serving was a weapon of truth, a quiet but powerful strike against falsehood. In retrospect, historians see in this an accidental form of cultural diplomacy, more effective than any carefully crafted propaganda. Ice cream, pies, chocolate, and cigarettes did more to change minds than broadcasts and leaflets. The prisoners wrote home honestly because the detail was too striking to conceal, and the families believed them, because who would invent such absurdity? As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, Europe rebuilt itself. Former prisoners took jobs in cities, rebuilt farms, attended universities. Many credited their time in American camps with opening their eyes. They had learned English, studied new skills, read books they had never seen under censorship. They had eaten meals that made them question scarcity. They had tasted democracy not in speeches, but in the fairness with which meals were distributed, in the classes where guards and prisoners could discuss literature. They carried those impressions into post-war life. Some became advocates of closer ties with the United States. Others became teachers who told their students about the day they ate ice cream in captivity. The detail endured because it captured something bigger than itself, the collapse of illusion, the discovery of another world. By the time memoirs were written, the detail had become almost mythic. Writers described the astonishment of that first bite, the laughter in barracks, the incredulous letters home. Scholars studying memory noticed how often ice cream appeared in recollections, even decades later. It had become shorthand for abundance, a symbol of America's power and generosity. Veterans admitted that it was the moment they realized Germany could not win. If they can feed prisoners like this, one wrote, what can they do for their own armies? Such statements reveal the deep psychological impact of what seemed trivial. Ice cream was not just food, it was proof of capacity, an unanswerable argument in the war of perception. In America, the memory lingered in quieter ways. Communities that hosted POW camps remembered the oddity of seeing German soldiers on main streets, working in fields, buying treats at local stores. Farmers recalled that the prisoners worked hard and often seemed grateful. Children remembered the accents and the curiosity. In towns like Aliceville and Hereford, reunions were later held where former prisoners returned as guests, greeted not with suspicion but with friendship. At these events, ice cream often appeared again, served deliberately as a gesture of memory. Former enemies laughed together, remembering how something so small had once seemed so astonishing. The symbolism had not faded, it had only deepened. The letters themselves traveled across borders. Some were published in newspapers after the war, when censorship lifted, and editors sought to show readers glimpses of the enemy's humanity. Readers in Hamburg or Munich opened their papers and found letters describing ice cream in Texas or Georgia, and they shook their heads in wonder. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was there, in the handwriting of their own countrymen. These publications fueled debates about responsibility, guilt, and the future. If the enemy could show such humanity, what did that say about their own government's cruelty? If prisoners could eat ice cream while civilians starved, what did that say about the priorities of the Reich? These questions spread quietly but powerfully, reshaping perceptions. In later decades, as historians compiled testimonies, they came to see ice cream as more than a curiosity. It was a lens into the collapse of totalitarian illusions. It showed how quickly ordinary men could revise their understanding of the world when presented with undeniable evidence. It illustrated how propaganda could be undone not by abstract arguments, but by concrete experiences. And it revealed the strange power of food as symbol, how a sweet treat could embody abundance, kindness, and the promise of another way of life. Books and documentaries devoted pages to these anecdotes, recognizing that they carried lessons not only about the past, but about the nature of truth itself. For the men who lived it, the memory was more personal. They remembered the taste, the texture, the way it contrasted with the hunger of their youth. They remembered the letters, the way their pens scratched across cheap paper, the effort to describe something so mundane yet so astonishing. They remembered the reactions, the incredulity of families, the tears of mothers who realized that their sons were safe and even thriving. These memories accompanied them for the rest of their lives, a strange and bittersweet souvenir of captivity. In interviews late in life, many said it was the detail that stuck most. Not the guards, not the fences, not the long days of work, but the ice cream. That was the detail that became story, the story that became symbol. The deeper meaning of all this lies in what it reveals about humanity. In the midst of the most destructive war in history, amidst rubble and mass death, amidst hatred and propaganda, a small act of generosity resonated across continents. It showed that war could not erase the basic human impulse to share, to comfort, to extend kindness even to enemies. It showed that lies could not withstand simple truths experienced firsthand. It showed that memory preserves not only battles but also flavors. and that those flavors can carry lessons for generations. The letters about ice cream remind us that history is not only about strategy and politics, but also about the small details that change hearts. As the prisoners aged and the war receded into history, their stories were collected in archives. In some cases, descendants donated the letters to museums. Scholars studying them were struck by the sincerity of the words, by the mixture of guilt and gratitude. They saw in them evidence of how culture spreads, how perceptions shift, how truth travels. They realized that propaganda can be powerful but fragile, undone by a single experience of kindness. And they saw that food, in its simplest form, can be an ambassador more persuasive than speeches. The prisoners themselves never set out to make history. They only wrote what they saw, what they tasted. But in doing so, they changed the way their families and communities understood the war. In the end, the story of prisoners writing home about ice cream is a story about the unexpected power of the ordinary. It is about how small comforts can reveal vast truths, how a single bite can carry the weight of entire ideologies collapsing. It is about how men who once believed lies came to see the world differently, and how they carried that vision back to families hungry not only for food, but for hope. It is about how history is made not only on battlefields, but also in kitchens and letters, in scoops of ice cream served behind barbed wire. And it is about how memory, passed down through generations, can preserve those truths long after the men themselves are gone. The war ended, the camps closed, the men returned, but the letters remained. They told of a moment when propaganda broke, when reality asserted itself in the sweetest of forms. They told of prisoners who became witnesses, of families who found hope, of a defeated people who glimpsed another way of life. And they remind us today that even in the darkest times, small gestures can matter more than grand speeches, and that sometimes the simplest story, a letter about ice cream, can carry the greatest truth.